welcome everyone. I'm going to give our audience a moment to join us. How are y'all doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
Doing great.
Great. I see the audience is starting to trickle in. Welcome everyone. We're going to get started with today's content. My name is Allison LaForgia. I am the Senior Webinar and Events Manager at HW Media. Today, our webinar is the importance of portfolio monitoring in a rising rate environment, hosted by Accurate Group. A few housekeeping items before we jump into today's content. We will be having a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. You can submit questions at any time by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will be sending a recording of this webinar in the next few days. So if there's any part that you miss or you want to send it to anyone, it will be available afterwards. Now with that, I want to introduce today's panel. We have Brandon Winters and Bob Martin, and I'm going to give them both a moment to introduce themselves. Brandon, let's start with you.
Well, I'm Brandon Winters. I'm the SVP and Director of Alternative Valuations at the Accurate Group. I've been involved in valuations of all kinds for the last 17 years, starting with a company called eMortgage Logic, and 4 years ago started Emerge Property Solutions, and recently was acquired by the Accurate Group about a year ago. So we've been enjoying that partnership, and yeah, our focus is on broker price opinions, evaluations, inspections, all of those types of products.
And Bob?
Sure. Bob Martin. I'm the president of P23 Consulting, which is essentially serving the mortgage servicing business in an operations capacity. I've been in the mortgage business 25 plus years with Homecomings RFC and 14 years at Fannie Mae, running a bunch of different operations and analytics areas there. So a lot of time spent in mortgage servicing and oversight.
Great. Well, let's pull up the slides for today's conversation, and we are going to start with a few poll questions.
Yeah, so I'm interested in finding out kind of what the group's thoughts are on what to expect in 2023. Are we optimistic about 2023, or indifferent, or a little bit more pessimistic about the stake of property values and just market trends in general?
Right. So here are our results from that first poll question. What do you guys think?
I think we're a lot, most of the way, and depreciation there. I think we're all on the same page there. Although it's tough to know for sure, Bob. I think, but I do tend to think that depreciation is probably in our future.
Yep, I would agree. We're gonna talk to that a lot, but yeah, I think we're probably on the same page with the majority there in the voting.
All right. Now let's launch that second poll question.
Yeah. So what will the main driver of portfolio risk be in 2023? Is it going to be employment or unemployment? Home prices, interest rates, just continued risks associated with inflation, which kind of impacts all of those things.
Interesting. This one's sort of more mixed than I had thought it would be. All right, let's share these results.
Interesting indeed. Yeah, I think it's certainly all of those things, right? Is this on par with what you would think, Bob?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a combination of them. Definitely the rising rates, and what the Fed's still planning to do in 2023 is going to drive a lot of the employment, the home prices to a certain degree, and we'll see what it does to curb inflation. I mean, I think we've we've seen a little bit of flattening here recently. We'll see whether that continues into Q1, but I think definitely the Fed driving the interest rates up and still voicing that that desire is going to have a huge impact, especially on our industry.
And our third and final poll question for today.
Yeah, I think would love to get a gauge on how you feel your company's ready to manage the portfolio risk. Are you fully prepared, somewhat prepared? Are you not prepared or not concerned at all?
What if all the results were just no? Not concerned at all.
Not concerned, no risk.
Yeah, then we're done, right? I mean, yeah.
That would be a little counteractive to the answers to the first question. Very pessimistic about the future. But we're not going to do anything to prepare for it at all.
Hope for the best. All right.
Contrary to popular belief, maybe hope is a strategy.
All right. I think
no one is not concerned. So that's
positive. Yep.
That's good.
All right. Now let's jump into the actual content for today and start getting into the current state of affairs.
Perfect. Well, as we kind of think about what's going on right now, I mean, probably stating the obvious here that rate increases are certainly having effects all over our industry, and we've got origination volume that's down. Certainly, refinance volume is down. In an odd kind of situation, delinquencies have remained low and stable for now, which is what I'm observing from my purview is that the interesting thing that we're seeing happening is a flattening on both sides of the mortgage industry, which isn't normally kind of how we see. We've always tended to view our industry as cyclical, but seems like we're in a place right now where both sides tend to be a little flat, which is somewhat of a unique period of time. In my opinion, Bob, and you've got a little bit more tenure than I do. Have you seen anything like this in the past, or?
No, I mean, this is definitely unique. I mean, it's nothing like what it was in 2008 and 9. With delinquencies remaining low, this is kind of, or is definitely different. Rates have gone up, and so the origination volume. I mean, refinances are basically gone. The purchase volume is down considerably. People just aren't going to be moving if they've got a nice 3% rate, or they would tend to stay in their home if given the choice. But I think with the appreciation we've seen in house prices, there's just a good equity cushion in most homes, or in a larger percentage of homes than there have been in the past. And people are able to, or have been able to, refi out of potentially bad situations, and unemployment stays low. So, I mean, you take all those things together, and we're just not seeing the delinquencies rise at this point.
Yeah, the key word is at this point, right? It's a lot of yet, and
right,
it's going to happen. And to be perfectly clear to everyone on the call, I have no idea either. Bob, are you certain of the future? Do you have the crystal ball?
Absolutely not.
Well, then we'll move on. This is the effect of those things. Certainly, interest rates have significantly increased, and we do expect those to increase into next year. That housing demand has slowed quite a bit. Mortgage repurchases are on the rise, so we're seeing the GSEs pushing some loans back, which I think is creating a liquidity problem, which in turn can create different challenges and reduce options overall for lenders. We're seeing, Fannie Mae is predicting negative home price growth for next year. Although not extremely, not an extreme reduction. And we're seeing the consolidation of mortgage companies happen quite frequently. It feels like every week or two, we're getting another announcement that somebody's being acquired, and things are making changes there. So kind of all these collectively are creating kind of ripples throughout the industry here. With the Fed, focused on curbing inflation, we can see a slowing of the economy that could create some unemployment and start driving some of that delinquency. Because I do feel like we're probably certainly headed towards a recession if we're not already in one. I know several people that feel like we're already in one, and that's tough to argue as well. But certainly to your point, Bob, I think it's much more mild, or at least much different than what we experienced in 2008. So yeah, what are your thoughts on kind of these impacts and effects, Bob?
I would say, Fannie's predicting, a moderate negative home price growth. I think the NAR is predicting a slight appreciation, but everything is very, very close to, kind of a moderation point. I think a lot of it's going to depend upon how much the Fed keeps pushing rates. So, we saw the inflation number come out and stabilize a little bit. We saw a bond and stock rally, but immediately, I'm sure everybody's kind of seen the latest comments from the Fed that they weren't happy with that result, and intend to continue pushing rates. So they are definitely ascribing to a pushing unemployment to stave off inflation. So as they push rates, hopefully to get the unemployment numbers that they're looking for, that is going to ultimately turn into delinquencies, in the mortgage business. So I think we're all kind of in a wait to see what happens, kind of what the January, February numbers look like, what the Fed does, in December. But I think the resounding sentiment is that rates are going to continue to go up, and that's just going to continue to put an excess burden on the mortgage industry specifically.
Yeah, and I think we're still benefiting from the equity growth of the last few years. There's still a pretty significant supply problem, right? So it feels like we can't fix one without it. We'd have to fix the supply problem to drive the prices significantly lower.
Right. And that's probably why we haven't seen the home price declines, right? Demand's down, but supply's down too. So you got both of them coming down, and that's helping to keep prices where they are, values where they are.
Yeah. Well, we think about the economic impacts continually here. Bob, there's two areas that we had discussed previously about that may see some increased delinquencies. You want to talk about kind of what areas we see that we're kind of already starting to see those trends,
right?
Increase.
Yeah. So, obviously the Florida areas that were hit by the hurricane, servicers are seeing, a higher delinquency in there. Fannie Mae commented that, they're experiencing and expecting higher delinquencies in that corridor there. So, portfolio concentrations that have a high concentration down there are probably already experiencing people struggling to make payments. So that's definitely an area of concern. And then, government loans. So, and that's kind of a broad brush in that, many government loans, or a higher proportion of government loans, are first-time home buyers. They're higher LTVs. So when you start to see unemployment go up, a lot of times the government loans get hit, a little bit harder than a lot of the other areas. They have less options with the higher LTVs and that kind of thing. And there's still a higher number of government loans in forbearance from COVID. So we're still seeing that effect, where servicers are still having to carry the forbearances on their books. So it will remain to be seen, if the economy gets worse, will the forbearance tool essentially be used like it was during COVID to help kind of temporarily move borrowers through this.
Yeah, I mean, to your earlier point, we're seeing already borrowers having more options now than certainly previously because of those equity cushions. And you can sell out of your problems. You can refinance even at the higher rate. If you can cash out a little bit, you got those equity cushions. There's opportunity to get out of a bad situation, right? So,
right. Yeah, and rates are high right now, but they won't always be, right? So even if you have to refi at 7%, at some point they will come back down somewhat, and then you can refi at that point. So given that type of scenario, you can still potentially refi if you run into troubles.
So how does all this affect servicing and portfolio management? So we're touching on these things. Home price appreciation has slowed over the past quarter, but there's still considerable equity. So due to the overall increase in home price for the past couple of years, there's a large equity swing over the last, 5 years. The interesting thing is that a recent study by Adam points out that an increasing amount, so almost 50%, almost half of the mortgages have less than a 50% LTV, which creates a lot of cushion for any kind of negative thing that could happen. And we are seeing HELOC loan volume is on the rise due to the large amounts of equity. So we saw a dip, and then it's kind of increasing again as we see the opportunity to get a HELOC. Kind of thoughts on this, Bob?
Yeah, I would say, if participants haven't looked at that Adam study, it's very interesting. And it kind of mentions this overall broad brush of 50% at about 50 LTV or below. And then it goes up and kind of talks about pockets going up. So we're going to get into kind of portfolio stratification, that type of talk. But again, it comes down to the pockets. I mean, most areas are having equity in their properties, but in different pockets and in different submarkets, you can run into much higher LTV properties. But for the most part, the equity position of most mortgages is much more favorable than it's been in a while.
Absolutely, I would think. Again, much different scenario than what we've seen before, for sure, as we look at the current state of the market.
Right.
The subject matter of today was the importance of portfolio monitoring, and I think now it's incredibly important to make sure you're paying attention to identify those pockets. So when values are increasing, I mean, we see, monitoring values, certainly a less critical factor, important. But certainly as values decrease, it's really imperative to monitor those LTVs, understand what property values are doing, and it can change really, really quickly. So servicers need to make sure they're monitoring the slowing of the home value appreciation and or the declines in certain geographic concentrations of the portfolio. And borrower credit quality declines as the economy slows. And if unemployment increases sharply, then tracking what's happening is incredibly important for a number of reasons, right? So, Bob, what are the things that people are going to be or need to be focusing on as we get into potential pockets that you were referring to?
Yeah, I think in coming up slides, we have a few points or a few areas, but basically, I mean, tracking the LTVs on the properties, the unemployment, and the credit of borrowers. So those are three easily obtained data points for any portfolio. Now, granted, getting updated FICOs or whatever costs some money. Getting AVMs is going to cost some money, but in the grand scheme of this, as unemployment rises, which we would expect it to do next year, knowing where the issues are in your portfolio is going to be critical. So, kind of running regular AVMs, running unemployment numbers, looking at jobless claims in particular areas. Those are all critical to knowing kind of where you're starting to see softness in your own portfolio. And there are so many factors that would drive that. You got to kind of look at the portfolio makeup, obviously, of kind of what your portfolio looks like. But some of these things may not have an effect on a borrower's ability to continue to pay their mortgage. But when you start to layer those things on top of one another, and it's one thing on top of another, that's when you tend to see a much higher level of risk in certain pockets.
We go right into talking about the tools, right? So you're talking about checking borrower credit scores. Those portfolio sweeps, I've been doing those for a very long time, where you cascade a product line, where you can run, regular AVMs, or there's certain different types of AVM products that are offered that allow you to, very, pretty affordable price to just sweep the portfolio. And, it's not full AVMs, but you start to see trends and data sets that you can get back and say, okay, this is where I need to kind of hearken in and look and say, okay, I'm starting to see some things that are some red flags here, and determine what your next steps are. Same with unemployment trends.
So to jump in super quickly,
Yeah.
When is the time to get more information about an asset? When would you want to get that information from something like an inspection or a BPO?
Yeah, I think the right time is generally what we usually see is there's an issue with the asset. There's some kind of delinquency or something that's triggering an event, usually around the 60-day mark of delinquency is generally the standard that we view. Earlier may make sense if there's a particular situation that calls for it, but in a market and where there's some volatility, which I would certainly expect the chance for that to occur over the next year, it's going to be pretty important to get eyes on the property early. So you're going to want to identify the occupancy of that asset. If there's some, overall, just someone's not maintaining the property, any kind of damage, things like that. Because things can change really quickly, it's tough in some cases to get some of the more automated products to be right up to speed. So when you start to see the softening in certain sections of your portfolio, we have clients that order BPOs on properties more so because they have a collection of assets that they're worried about. So it's not necessarily a focus on a particular delinquent asset, but they'll order some types of products in certain area just because they're worried about it. But generally we'll see them in the delinquency scenarios. So get the eyes on the property. You're going to get a clearer picture than maybe what you can get from a lot of the different automation, just simply because you've got an agent on the ground able to identify things that are happening quickly, incorporating listings, which, and when there's market volatility, you start to see things in the listings that can be a little bit more telling of what's to come. We're already starting to see some depreciation occur in listings, longer DOMs. It may take longer for sales to occur, which if you're just basing things on sales, sometimes you're already behind. So generally, as you start to see those red flags that we can talk about here about layered risk, I think that's a good time to get an inspection and or a BPO, to start to identify what's going on with that asset and what's going on in that neighborhood, and start to identify the market trends that are occurring there. What are your thoughts about, and when did you guys always order BPOs in general?
Pretty much along the lines of what you said. I mean, the great thing about the valuation data that's available in the industry, and all the companies like Accurate that have a variety of valuation products, is you can start cheap with a basic AVM, like you're saying, and then as pockets move, you kind of escalate up to a maybe an AVM with an inspection, and then move up to a BPO. So you basically identify your pockets of risk as you go, and you make a really good point. Is if you're only looking at sales, you can be behind. Now, granted, days on market have been really low of late, but if they start to lengthen out, your listings are going to give you an indication of where things are going. So you definitely, if you're looking at value products and at kind of what the comparable properties are in a neighborhood, you definitely want to take a look at where the listings are coming into.
Absolutely. I am. It's funny to me. Obviously the shock value of different articles that get published on a daily basis or whatnot. It's always funny to see days on market and all over the country have increased 200%. It's like, yeah, well, we went from 5 to 15 days. Okay, we're still pretty good.
Right.
So all of these things, it's important to focus on the facts. And we've seen certainly all year I've seen different things of delinquencies increasing at these rapid numbers. It's like, well, we're coming from 0, so that's not
right.
Not exactly everything. So I think there's a lot of noise, and certainly segments of our industry that want to will things into existence. But it's important to focus on what's actually happening and getting that actual data. And I think when there's a lot of confusion, that's when it's really important to hunker down, and maybe then it's the time to get some more data that you're actually seeing, that you can put your hands on, that's relative to your portfolio and your borrowers, and see exactly what's happening. So yeah, so we talk about just that layered risk. To your earlier point, Bob, when portions of your portfolio are experiencing the reduced FICO, the unemployment increases, and property value decreases, it's important to prepare for delinquencies. And so we think about that layered risk and preparing. What do our participants need to understand about being prepared for potential delinquencies, or just potential challenges or varied risk within the portfolio that hasn't necessarily existed in the recent past?
Right. I would say to start, definitely these, like I said before, the layering of these 3 pieces on the left, as more of those occur in a pocket, the higher your risk of a borrower not continuing to make their mortgage payments. It is important, I think it's important to kind of get updated FICOs on your borrowers, even if they're remain current, right? If their FICO obviously starts to decline, they're probably not paying everybody else, but they're still making their house payment. But there's an issue there. So I would say kind of the overarching thing is be proactive in your portfolio, right? You don't want to wait and react until a borrower goes 30 or 60 and then jump in and try and help. If you can run these things and see where your portfolio is softening, you could come up with campaigns, you could reach out, you can there are so many more loss mit tools available, and I think the biggest one that we're going to start to see used more is the forbearance piece. COVID kind of brought that to light. But if there are temporary unemployment situations because of the way the economy goes, a forbearance may be the best option. We'll see, how the GSEs, CFPB feel about kind of that, but they've been very good, or they were very good, I will say, during COVID, of really loosening up a lot of the bureaucratic paperwork and this kind of thing to really help borrowers. So I think overall that's been successful, and I think we'll see that again. But if a borrower is not able to stay in their home, so there's no retention solution, and they don't have a foreseeable future, a lot of them still have equity, right? Short sales are non-existent right now because values are so high. So, working with a borrower, they could walk away with the equity in their property. Now, granted, they got to find a new place to live, but at least they don't lose that big chunk of equity that they have in the property. So it seems like there's a lot more available options because the underlying scenario is completely different from what we saw back in the 08-09 scenario.
Do you foresee any of, I was just reading something about kind of the explosion over the last few years of vacation rentals and things like that, as if there is a shift away from the participation in those types of properties, kind of how does that impact things, considering the location of many of those assets and things like that?
Mm-hmm.
The LTVs may be pretty strong, but if they have to sit there for a while, or are the options different on vacation rental, Airbnb type properties that, Allison went and bought in Broken Bow, Oklahoma? She's been renting it out successfully for 3 years, and now nobody wants to go there.
This is a millennial problem, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a difference when you're talking about an investment property and a vacation home, that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of times those tend to, obviously have a higher delinquency rate or go down quicker just because, it was an income source. And if you're not getting, people coming to Broken Bow, Oklahoma to stay in your cabin, then it's hard to continue to make that mortgage payment, or you're less incented to continue to make that mortgage payment. So I think it's all going to depend upon kind of how far this recession and how deep the recession goes, and how big unemployment gets before the Fed starts to back off and encourage a little bit more demand activity. I think that's going to be critical next year, and we'll see how much further beyond 2023 it goes, depending upon what next year looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the article I read, the other article I read yesterday, was an increase in the Q3 property values in various of the opportunity zones, and so that is not necessarily the expected outcome either, right? Of kind of what's happening, but that's good news. But it is unusual in this climate, right? So,
right.
There's a lot of weird things happening all at once.
Yes, I would agree with that.
But I think it's important, sort of with all of that, to just focus back on what you said earlier about there's a lot of noise, and you just got to focus on the facts, and you just got to keep an eye out for those trends that you guys mentioned. And I think sort of seeing through this, and I also think it's so interesting to not read into like the sensational headlines. Yeah, the 200% up from zero it might be a scary percentage, but it's also coming up from zero. So it's important to keep those sort of perspective points in mind.
Exactly.
definitely. Yeah, and back to one of our poll questions, it sounds like everyone is either somewhat prepared or feels fully prepared. So I would assume, that that group is probably doing a lot of this already, right? So I think the biggest, or one of the biggest takeaways we have is just um, being proactive and ensuring that you are tracking your portfolio and looking for soft points, because as things change next year, it can go month to month, as things improve or decline or whatever. Knowing where your portfolio is going to be key, to proactively trying to address the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about looking at this year. I mean, I actually bought a house this year. We went 0 to 60 really quickly. We thought about selling in January. We start preparing our house. By the time I sell in April, interest rates are up 1.5%. I listed my property at, this price point and ended up getting a lot more for it. Getting out into the market and trying to turn around and buy something, and competing with other people who are trying to buy houses with equal or greater than equity position, or money down payment, funds, and all of that kind of stuff, and the competitiveness, right up to May. I moved in here and it wasn't June, July before it was already okay. Well, now instead of people, when they're listing their house, they're not getting 18 offers in a day, they're maybe getting 1 or 2 over the course of 2 weeks, and there's still good offers and it's strong. I haven't seen a huge decline in property values, but certainly the kind of craziness that was occurring earlier in the spring went away very quickly. And so I would anticipate that, over the next year, depending on how things swing, economically speaking, those changes can happen extremely quickly. So it's important to be ready for them, because it may only be a few weeks to go from one side to the other, right? So,
and I think it's also so interesting. It's a lot of what if in our dry, and we talked about it's a lot of what ifs and watching for and looking at these different sort of flags across the industry. And one of the interesting things is the serious delinquency rate. The FHA's serious delinquency rate in September was 4.7%, right? Which is such a small percentage, and a decrease because you finally moved out of the COVID period, and you knew that there were going to be some COVID exacerbated problems. And I would think you could sort of look at that in this situation and say, okay, well, we saw these stressors in this market, and we'll probably see a similar, not exactly the same sort of stressors in whatever is going to come. But I also think rates moved at such a rate where I think in the beginning of 2020, people were like, maybe we'll hit 6. And now it's 6 would be great. If we could get to the low 6s, that would be fabulous. Because we're in 7% now. So the market is just so unpredictable that you just have to keep an eye on sort of everything and sort of look at best practices. And I feel like, at least on our end, where we see people looking and sort of saying, okay, what can I do to be prepared? And what steps can I make now so that when things change, I'm not panicked?
Exactly.
and a lot of it's sticker shock, right? I mean, if you look at the, whatever it is, 75-year average of an interest rate on a mortgage, it's higher than where we're at now. And discussing with my grandmother when I was buying this house, it's like, well, the rates are, getting closer to 5. And she's like, man, my second house, I had a 12% rate and we liked it. It's like, we were excited.
Yeah. It's so interesting. There's been a couple articles that have come out recently, and one of them was talking about the percentage of realtors who are in the app market right now and active, and what percentage of that group of people who haven't been through market cycles. And I'm like, that is so wild. If you've only ever been in the COVID market, 7% is a wild percentage to you. You're looking at that and you're like, next to 30. Of course, you're like, this is insane. And even I spoke to, I was talking to someone today and they were like talking about when they bought their first house in the early 2000s. And they were like, we budgeted for 9 and we're thrilled. Like, we were so happy to get 8%, and like that was amazing at the time. So like it's the cyclical aspect of it is sort of like something that we're seeing a lot of, like across all sorts of coverage on the realtor side and also on the mortgage side, where you've had people who like maybe have just been in the COVID cycle and they're like, oh, okay, things are changing. What does this leveling look like?
Exactly.
Yep.
Well, good. Do we want to turn it over? Maybe some questions.
Yeah, let's jump into some questions. So the first one I have for y'all is, do you see the CFPB doing anything to change the regulatory framework in 2023 for servicing?
Let's pull out the crystal ball here and see what. So my opinion would be, given kind of where the CFPB is, the administration, this kind of thing, they're very very clearly making sure that servicers are doing what they say they're going to do, right? So it's very much ensuring that servicers are meeting all the demands that CFPB has laid out, which is great. The question will be, depending upon what happens, if unemployment starts going up, they were really good about reacting to kind of loosen up a little bit on the regulations to help out. So I personally don't see, unless it gets bad, and unless it is affecting consumers on a broader scale, like a nationwide type of scale, I don't see them doing a whole lot in that particular respect. But I can, I'll be the first to say that I was wrong. If they do, it's kind of it's difficult to predict what they're going to do, but it'll be interesting to see if there are certain pockets that are experiencing a downside, but not the entire nation, whether they relax things or not.
Yeah, one of the attendees also talks about here, it's not just the interest rate, it's the cost of the home that we're seeing is certainly, that's the thing. That was the counter argument with my grandmother as well, is, yeah, but you bought a 2,500 square foot home for $85,000 in a pretty good area. And it doesn't cost that anymore. So,
right.
I found out recently that my grandparents bought their first home, which was waterfront somewhere in New York City, for $3,000.
Wow.
I was like, that's insane. Absolutely. Like, we are not in the same place.
Yeah, we're not in the same place.
So we have another question that came in. Do you see a larger impact for risk factors in rural or urban markets, if there is any difference at all?
The interesting shift right now that's occurring is certainly we're around here, and I'm in Fort Worth, Texas. We saw kind of a push because of property values, a push to even more rural spaces out here. There was a lot more activity of different, neighborhoods springing up in more rural areas, and they may not remain rural for several years, but they all certainly are now. And so I do think it's a little bit different. When I think about the common rural area, I think they always tend to be a little bit more risk because it's more fragile. If there's a particular factory nearby or something nearby that's driving the economy for that particular area, and that goes out of business and 80% of the community is out of a job, and there's not a whole lot of places to shift that labor force. then I do think there's certainly risk. The interesting thing is some of the more rural areas I'm talking about that have recently seen more people move to them. They're remote workers that may be less impacted, but live in rural areas, and certainly that risk seems to maybe be a little softer. I mean, what do you think, Bob? I mean, so I feel like rural areas certainly have more risk, but
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, again, it's going to depend upon. I mean, rural and urban is kind of a broad brush, but in general, right, the rural areas, you know, there's typically less demand out there, and when things start to soften, you know, that there just aren't as many properties and not as many buyers in the rural areas. COVID was kind of a different scenario, people moving out to the rural areas, but now you're seeing a lot of them wanting to move back into more of the urban areas. So it's all going to depend upon, you know, as these things happen, what is the demand for housing in that particular area. I mean, you know, from doing valuations within, you know, a large metro area, there are pockets within that are doing great, and then there are pockets that are not. You know, and some of it can be unemployment, but a lot of it is just the demand for the housing that's there. The good thing we have, well, I mean, what's holding everything up right now is just the slow supply, and it's kind of across the board. So as long as the supply is still below where it needs to be, it's helping keep everything up. So I don't know, that's an interesting, you know, it's still going to depend pocket by pocket, honestly.
yeah, I mean, I think about communities in which are driven by a single source of business. When we think about kind of the large impact to the city of Detroit in 2008, you know, heavily driven by the fact that car manufacturers were not building cars there anymore, or you know, the large impact of the auto industry completely decimated that market, and now you know, diversified a lot of the economy up there, and still driven a little bit more. I mean, we still have auto manufacturers there, and there was a large you know, Quicken presence there and things like that. So there's more opportunity, I think, to shift in an urban market. But yeah, I think that's one of those layered risk things. If the economy in a particular pocket of your portfolio is driven by a single entity, that's a risk factor.
Right.
So yeah.
All right. Well, as we approach the top of the hour, I want to give you both time for some final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with. So if you had to pick a couple things just to say that are top of mind to keep an eye on as we look towards 2023, what would they be?
Well, I think you know, it certainly does feel like a hurry up and wait scenario and world that we're living in right now. But I mean, I just encourage people to not just wait, to sit and review your portfolios, pay attention to what's happening at the ground level, and help drive what you're going to do about what things happen outside of our control. And I think the best way to do that is to maintain understanding about the facts, not the sensational headlines or the different things that might be being fed, but certainly focusing on what's happening with your borrowers and what's happening with your portfolio, and managing it to benefit ultimately the best outcomes for your business and for the borrowers and overall for the market. What do you think, Bob?
You pretty much took my answer. So I guess I would just reiterate the, be proactive, monitor the pockets of the portfolio, and where you're starting to see softening, look at proactively what sort of campaigns you can do to try and reach out to borrowers or to help borrowers before it gets, before they get 60, 90 days delinquent type of thing. That's not the time to start trying to work something out to keep them in their home if you can. And yeah, I mean, we're going to have to wait and see what actually happens, and how far the unemployment goes up, assuming it's going to eventually go up, and where that unemployment actually occurs. That's kind of to me, the $1 million question is kind of where do we start to see softening of pockets that are driven by that.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Brandon, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. We are at the end of our time together. I want to thank you both for being here, and to our audience, thank you for submitting questions. If there's anything that we did not get to, we will be getting to you after the webinar today. Once again, Housing Wire will be sending out the recording of this webinar to registrants within the next few days, and the webinar will be available on our website at housingwire.com. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Hopefully we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.